90,000 Canadian jobs, one trade deal, and a question echoing through every boardroom in Washington right now. Why did Canada do this? Good evening, I'm Anchor Name, and if you've been following the Canada-U.S. trade tensions, tonight's story is the missing piece you haven't heard anywhere else. Stay with us, because what happened on January 16th in Beijing is now sitting at the center of the most important economic negotiation Canada has faced in a generation. Hit that like button if you want more stories the mainstream media buries. 3 months ago, Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Beijing and signed a deal that his government called a calculated bet. Canada slashed its tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6.1%, allowing up to 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market each year, with that number growing to 70,000 within 5 years. In return, China agreed to drop its crushing 84% tariff on Canadian canola down to roughly 15%, remove tariffs entirely on Canadian lobster, crab, and peas, and commit to investing in EV manufacturing on Canadian soil. On paper, it looked like a win for farmers, fishers, and Canada's clean energy future. But here's what nobody told you, and this is the part that changes everything. That same deal is now being described in official testimony before Canada's House of Commons as a vehicle-sized irritant in the very negotiations that could determine whether 90,000 Canadian auto workers keep their jobs. That phrase didn't come from a political opponent. It came from Brian Kingston, the president of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the man who represents Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis in Canada. He sat before a parliamentary committee and said that in every single meeting he attended with American industry representatives in Washington, the conversation started and ended with one question. Why did Canada do this? If that doesn't concern you, keep watching, because the answer reveals something much bigger about where Canada is headed. Let's get the facts straight, because this story has been misrepresented in ways that matter. The deal Carney signed is not a free trade agreement with China. It is a targeted, limited arrangement on specific products. Canada agreed to a quota, 49,000 Chinese EVs per year at the reduced tariff rate, not an open floodgate. That quota grows to 70,000 over 5 years. The deal also includes something most coverage has glossed over entirely, a commitment from Chinese companies to invest in EV manufacturing capacity inside Canada. This is not just about importing Chinese cars. Carney's team was betting that Chinese capital and battery technology could flow into Canadian factories, putting Canadian workers on the production floor, not just in the dealership. The question nobody can answer yet is whether that bet will pay off before the clock runs out. To understand why Carney made this move, you have to understand what Canada was facing before January 16th. Canola farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta had been bleeding for years under China's retaliatory 84% tariff, a trade wall that was shutting one of Canada's most valuable agricultural exports out of one of its biggest markets. The lobster and crab fisheries of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island were similarly squeezed. These are not abstract statistics. These are communities that depend on those markets to survive. Meanwhile, Carney had been saying publicly since Davos that Canada must deal with the world as it is, not as it wishes it to be. And the world as it is includes China, 1.4 billion people, the second largest economy on Earth, and a country that was causing real pain to real Canadian workers. For the canola farmers who had been waiting years for relief, January 16th was a genuinely good day. Andre Harp, chair of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, called it very good news that brought some certainty back to the industry. But the day the auto industry weighed in, the story got a lot more complicated. Here is what makes this a genuine dilemma and not just a political talking point. Both sides are right. The case for the deal is solid. Canadian farmers are getting relief. Atlantic fishers are getting market access. Canada is demonstrating that it has economic options beyond the United States, which actually strengthens its hand at the CUSMA negotiating table. A Canada with no other relationships, no other markets, no other leverage is a Canada that has to accept whatever terms Washington puts in front of it. Building alternatives is not weakness. It is strategy. But the case against is equally serious. CUSMA, the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, is up for formal review on July 1st. That is 68 days from now, and anything that complicates that negotiation carries a cost that cannot be ignored. Mexico, also a CUSMA partner, chose the opposite path. It raised tariffs on Chinese vehicles from 20% to 50% at the start of 2026, aligning itself with Washington's position. According to Kingston, Mexico's CUSMA negotiations are proceeding more smoothly than Canada's. That contrast is not a coincidence. Ontario's auto sector produced over 1.3 million vehicles in 2024, the overwhelming majority destined for the American market. If Washington decides that Canada's EV deal makes Canadian-assembled vehicles a potential backdoor for Chinese products, those 90,000 jobs are directly in the crosshairs. Kingston told the committee plainly, there is simply too much at stake if Canada is perceived as misaligned with Washington on China. These are not hypothetical fears. They are the lived experience of people who have spent the past several months in those Washington rooms, watching how the China deal lands in real time. So what happens now? Carney announced a new advisory committee on Canada-U.S. economic relations on April 21st. It holds its first meeting in 4 days, on April 27th. This committee will have to answer one of the hardest diplomatic questions Canada has faced in years. How does Canada protect what it gained from the China deal? The canola relief, the fishing market access, the manufacturing investment, while convincing Washington that Canada is not becoming a backdoor for Chinese goods into North America? The answer likely involves airtight rules of origin, ensuring Chinese EVs sold in Canada cannot be re-exported to the United States and do not count as North American content under CUSMA. It likely requires proactive, direct communication with American counterparts explaining exactly what the deal does and does not permit. And it requires Canada making unmistakably clear that welcoming Chinese investment in Canadian manufacturing is about building Canadian industry, not handing China a key to the American market. These are complex questions. They need to be answered before July 1st. 68 days. The clock is not waiting. Here is the honest truth about where Canada stands tonight. This was a real decision made under real pressure with real consequences on both sides. Canola farmers needed relief. Fishers needed market access. Canada needed to prove it had options. Carney made a bet. Whether that bet pays off or blows up the most critical trade negotiation in a generation will be decided in the next 68 days. In rooms most Canadians will never see, by people most Canadians will never meet, over stakes that will affect every Canadian regardless. The advisory committee meets in 4 days. The CUSMA review begins in 68. Canada does not have the luxury of getting this wrong. We are tracking this story daily. Every development, every shift in the negotiations, every move from Washington and Beijing. If you want to stay ahead of what is actually happening to Canada's economy, drop a comment below telling us what you think. Did Carney make the right call? Or did he just hand Washington a weapon? Share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually at stake before July 1st. And if you want the clearest, most honest breakdown of Canadian economic and political news every single day, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we exist to tell.